Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Matt coming today from the remote outpost of Radical Compliance in Denver, Colorado. Matt, welcome.
Hello, Tom. I am in Denver for Workiva's annual user conference, where they had about 2,500 internal auditors and SEC reporting and corporate sustainability types internal auditors. Big event, very nicely done. Their keynote speakers included Michelle Obama and George Clooney. Top that. It has been quite an interesting time out here.
Well, I was at the Diligent Elevate conference, although I scampered out of Houston early to avoid the hurricane, and they had the whistleblower from Wirecard from Singapore, and then they had a supervisory board of director from Wirecard. The first keynote, the second keynote was Aaron Brockovich. So no one will ever beat Michelle Obama, but it was pretty good.
All right.
So, Matt, we had an interesting series of pre-taliation enforcement actions by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And although the dollar figures were not high, you really saw some interesting expansions of that. I'm not sure about that, but we can debate about that. So why don't you tell us about the enforcement actions?
Sure. So this is yet another of the occasional SEC crackdowns on pre-taliation language, which is defined as anything in employment contracts you or company might use that would somehow constrain employees or others from going to regulators to alert them about potential misconduct at the organization. And pre-taliation is not a new thing. They've been enforcing it for the better part of 10 years now, and we have these occasional enforcement actions streak across the sky. So that happened, I think it was on Monday, when the SEC sanctioned 7 different companies, a total of $3 million for pre-taliation language they had used in employment contracts up into from 2019 until well into 2023. Which is interesting because we've been talking about retaliation as a thing you shouldn't do since 2016. And why are these companies not getting the message? We can discuss that. It was an assortment of companies, a total of 7. The biggest offender was Acadia Healthcare Corporation. They run behavioral healthcare centers, I think it is, around the United States. They agreed to pay a $1.4 million civil penalty. Everybody else, TransUnion was one, IDEX Corporation was another, a couple of other smaller businesses I am not familiar with. They all paid anywhere from about $690,000 down to $19,000 in civil penalties. But Tom, here's the thing, is that the employment agreements they were using did actually say, yes, employee, of course you can always go to a regulator if you believe there is misconduct. And then, broadly speaking, all of these employment agreements also said you can go to the regulator anytime you'd like, provided that you forfeit any right to actual whistleblower awards that you might be eligible for because of the tip you bring them. So the SEC swooped in and said, no, you can't do that. That's wrong. That does violate SEC whistleblower rules, which say that a company cannot constrain an employee from going to a regulator. And think it through. If you can go to a regulator, but you're not allowed to reap any potential financial reward for doing so, that has a chilling effect on potential whistleblowers, because why would you risk your economic livelihood, risk your career prospects, and at the end of the day, you've done all of that, and 4 years later, the SEC says, well, we'd be happy to give you $500,000, $3 million, $20 million, but you can't claim it because the company made you sign away your rights to collect that financial reward. And that was interpreted as having a chilling effect on the whistleblower's ability to speak up. And so all these companies have now been sanctioned, and they are all busy fixing their employment contracts.
So here's my slight disagreement with you, Matt. The contract clause that these companies had in place is illegal in 2 ways. One, it violates the SEC whistleblower provision, but it also violates basic contract law. You cannot make illegal contact with a third party if that third party is going to pay benefits to you. Meaning, a company cannot require an employee to legally waive the right to payment from some other third party. Now, they put it in there clearly. And so that led me to try to figure out why they would do it. Well, here's what I think. I think they're trying to scare employees by putting clearly, in a lawyer's mind, clearly illegal language in the contract. But if you're not a lawyer or you're an employee, you may not know it's illegal. And you may think exactly what you said, that it is going to, if I'm going to put my career on the line and I'm not going to get anything from it, I may think twice about it. And so I see a much more sinister attempt by companies here to try to get around the desire of the SEC to reward whistleblowers with a financial incentive. And I don't think that's an expansion of the SEC's basic premise. What I see is companies expanding out ways to try to denigrate the right of employees with language that, in my mind, is clearly illegal in basic contract law.
Well, Tom, I think probably then you're spot on, because I am not a lawyer and I did not know that about contract law. But in my somewhat sophisticated analysis as a layman, I would look at a contract like that and say, okay, they told me I have to give up the money. And to be clear, they were express about that there is a sample clause from Acadia Healthcare that the SEC included in the settlement order, where it does talk about, and it says, quote, you have the right to file an administrative charge or participate in administrative proceeding, provided, however, and those phrases are underlined, provided, however, that you then therefore have to go and give up the potential for a financial reward. So the intent here for how employees would interpret that is crystal clear. And like I said, I did not know that would violate one of the basic tenets of contract law. But my point, I think, is that, it's frustrating now to see companies are still trying to wiggle their way around this. And, this is why we can't have nice things, people, is because the SEC has been abundantly clear on what it does not want to see. And yet we still have these agreements that are trying to be too clever by half and wind up just upsetting the SEC. And so here we are. It's funny, Tom, I have been thinking about pre-taliation. We have talked about it several times on this podcast now. And for a long time, I used to say that it was a fairly straightforward fix. You just look at all of your employment contracts, you find the pre-taliation language, and you drop it. I'm starting to think maybe it is harder than that, because we have seen the SEC slowly but surely keep pushing the envelope on what it will consider an enforceable offense. It used to be employment.
Can I stop you there?
Yeah, sure.
Because that really leads into the next section, I hope, of this podcast. And I will tell our listeners, this is the fourth time that Compliance Into the Weeds has taken up pre-taliation. I can't tell you the number of times Matt has blogged about it, but I will tell you that every time he blogs about it, he gives you the answer, and he gives you the remediation, and he gives you the actions to take. And that's what you're about to go into. So I'm going to use that to introduce, for the fourth time, Matt, will you tell companies and compliance professionals what they need to do? Because you've told them 3 other times in black and white.
Well, all you need to do is find these problematic clauses and get rid of them. That's it. Now, I don't know what the contract law clauses were prior to 2019 for these companies. Did they have more restrictive language? And then they tried to say, well, we'll let them go to the regulator, but we'll just try to get them to forfeit any right to a reward. I don't know. Has it always been like this? The settlement orders are not clear on that, but you can't have this language, and you can't constrain them from approaching regulators really in any way. What is interesting to me, Tom, is that originally it was just employment contracts with employees. Now, lately, we have seen that there are also retaliation enforcement actions against companies because they're trying to do the same in contracts with customers. This was financial services firms, it was JP Morgan, but JP Morgan had told customers, if we have an issue and it results in a settlement to you, customer, of more than $1,000, you cannot go to a regulator to talk about potential violations without letting us know first. And the SEC swooped in and said, no, that's retaliation now against customers. And now we have these sort of halfway there pre-taliation remediation where they said, yes, you can go to a regulator, but no, you can't claim a reward. Well, that's not full remediation. You had to get rid of that second part too, and they didn't. So I've been thinking, about how hard is this? And I was talking with a compliance officer on this subject just the other week, and he stopped me and he said, Matt, you are under the illusion that there is some magical person at the company who can do this. And there isn't. This is a team approach, and we don't even know who necessarily is on the team. And that's the challenge here, is that you don't know how many of these contracts there are. You don't know who is authoring these contracts. You don't have any single uniform policy drafted by compliance or HR or legal to say, this is what these contracts should include, this is what they can't include. And he basically said there's too many chefs here in the kitchen, and we can't cut through all of that clutter to solve this problem. And that's a very common challenge at large companies. And I was struck by his analysis of it because he's right. At a theoretical level, it's easy to understand what the remediation is, but it gave me pause about how difficult it might be for large companies to get this remediation done in practice.
That really ties into the next observation I wanted to make, which was, I think we need to stop talking about employment contracts and start talking about contracts. Because you have a customer contract, you'll have a supply chain vendor contract, you may have an agent or other business development relation contract. And that's going to be a wide variety of different functions within the corporation, a wide variety perhaps even within your corporate legal department. And I think you're spot on. But the compliance officer needs to figure out who owns doing contracts. Is it a commercial team? Does the supply chain have their own lawyers? If it's a B2C business, do the customer-facing businesses have their own lawyers? Do you have a series of contracts with third parties who help you on the sales side of things through business development? So I think they need to stop thinking about employment contracts and think about contracts.
It's an interesting point that if you think this through at a process level, what would your process be to manage this challenge? Because I guess you would say it's one part policy management, one part contract management, in that you would need a policy enterprise-wide about here are the constraints you have to obey when forming a contract with an outside party, like a policy about contracts. I don't know how convoluted and big that might be because I'm not a contracts lawyer, but for our immediate problem here, you would certainly have that policy say you cannot include any retaliatory language. It's interesting that we only see the SEC ever enforce this, but I would be curious, and Tom, I don't know if we ever have thought about this before, if the Justice Department has ever encountered any retaliatory contract language a company might have imposed on agents or other third parties, and maybe there is an FCPA enforcement action that a company is trying to use contracts to curtail everybody, and so they can't go to the Justice Department. I can see that probably in the criminal context, that gets pretty ugly pretty quickly. But I would be very curious to see how other regulators might think about pre-taliation language as well. And I don't know how much discretion they have to enforce. The SEC clearly has a lot because of the Dodd-Frank program. I don't know if you have any observations there.
Well, first of all, when I was at Halliburton, we had a 10-page commercial contract policy. I have seen 80 to 100-page commercial contract policies. They can widely diverge depending on the company. But I don't think the DOJ has thought about that because they didn't have a whistleblower financial incentive program until this summer. I think now this may become very high on their radar the standard clauses you try to get for FCPA anti-corruption protection in contracts typically don't have the language you cited, but doesn't mean that some companies haven't tried to put that in there. But I think if the DOJ gets wind of any of this, they will come down like a ton of bricks on any company that tries that and tries to prevent a foreign third-party agent or even a domestic third-party agent from reporting bribery and corruption, although typically would be the third-party agent who's engaged in the bribery and corruption.
And, I suppose I would just bring this back a little bit to what is the compliance officer supposed to do here? It looks to me like there is a three-part approach to solving this, that the compliance officer, the HR team, and the legal team would all need to work together to figure out how are we going to eradicate these pre-taliatory clauses from all of our contracts, either employment or other. And then just go through and make sure we can do this at an enterprise scale. CBRE, the real estate firm, they were sanctioned on this a while back, and they listed some rather extensive remediation that they did because CBRE is a very decentralized worldwide real estate organization. So they had to go and make sure that all of the local affiliates were following this. They had to follow up with an audit. You would need to track down any former employees who might have signed these years ago and let them know that they are now free to discuss any violations with any regulator without constraint. So there is a lot to do here. And one other final point, I know that this is going to be hard and tangly and complicated, and there might be some companies that say, do we really have to do this? Because are we going to face enforcement? And even if we do, some of the enforcement fines here are pretty small. Well, yes and no. I have been struck that lately, not with these cases this week, but in some recent past actions, the SEC has been hitting firms with fines of 10 million, 18 million, multi-million dollar fines. That's not necessarily chump change. And when you do see the very rare instances where companies have used this language to try and stifle a whistleblower, then the SEC hits the roof. And then suddenly, whatever fine you might have been looking at, increase that by a multiple of 10. Now, as I've said, in almost every instance of these retaliatory language enforcement actions, they've never actually used those clauses, but we have seen one or two. And anytime the SEC seems to find a new form, such as when they sanctioned JP Morgan for using the retaliatory language in contracts with customers. Suddenly we went from fines of $500,000 or $1 million or 1.4 that JP Morgan got fined $18 million. It's not a lot for JP Morgan, but it's not nothing. And I'm sure it wasn't a fun time for what really should be an easy, straightforward remediation project. Maybe not easy, but it's clear cut. It's straightforward what you have to do.
That really brings up the last question I wanted to ask you, which is, do you have any idea how the SEC found out about these clauses, absent some other type of enforcement action or even inquiry by the SEC into the companies, at least the ones listed in your blog post?
No, we do not know how the SEC got wind of these specific 7 companies. We do know that the SEC goes on these retaliation enforcement sweeps from time to time. And I fully expect that in another 8 or 12 or 14 months' time, we'll be talking about this a 5th time. They have been doing this off and on throughout the Biden administration. They did it less often, but they did do it during the Trump administration. It started, I think the first one was in 2016. I don't know if the SEC is actually just picking companies at random, or they're getting tips, or they are targeting industries. If anybody out there knows how the SEC is thinking this through and wants to confidentially tell us, I would be all ears. But I don't think that the SEC is done with this. At this point, why would they? It's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel with some of these companies. They just, it's an easy, straightforward solution you have to follow. You're not following it. You can't really defend against it. It's in the contracts, and the law is pretty clear on the SEC's side. So why wouldn't the SEC take an enforcement action? Even without a civil penalty, They can still drag you through the mud of a proceeding and make you fix this.
No, I agree. Well, Matt, I didn't think we were going to get 20 minutes out of this topic, but we did. So I can't wait to see what next week brings us.
Thank you, Tom.